The loudest mistake people make is believing silence means weakness. A light spring rain settled gently over downtown Chicago as yellow reflections shimmered across wet streets and polished sidewalks. Morning traffic moved steadily between glass towers while people hurried beneath umbrellas, barely noticing the dozens of taxis weaving through the city. Among them was one older sedan that looked almost forgotten beside the sleek black luxury vehicles surrounding it. Behind the wheel sat Ethan Walker, a 56-year-old taxi driver, whose calm blue eyes reflected years of quiet experience rather than exhaustion. His neatly pressed light blue shirt, dark jacket, and carefully maintained cab revealed a man who respected his work even if few people ever noticed. Every morning began the same way. Ethan wiped the dashboard until it shined, checked the tire pressure, filled a small cooler with bottled water for passengers, and placed a fresh packet of mint candies beside the back seat. None of those small gestures earned larger fares, but they reminded him that dignity was something a person chose, not something others awarded. His first few rides had been ordinary. A nurse finishing the night shift, a young father rushing to catch a train, an elderly woman carrying fresh flowers to visit her husband. Ethan greeted each passenger with the same warm smile, wished them a peaceful day, and never forced conversation unless they invited it. Just after 9 o'clock, his dispatcher called with a scheduled pickup at a quiet residential neighborhood overlooking Lake Michigan. Ethan arrived exactly on time. Standing outside an elegant brick home was an elderly gentleman dressed in a simple charcoal overcoat, carrying only a small leather briefcase. His silver hair framed a thoughtful face, and despite his age, he moved with steady confidence. Ethan immediately stepped out of the taxi, opened the rear door, and offered a polite greeting. "Good morning, sir." The older man smiled warmly. "Thank you for being punctual." Ethan nodded. "It is my pleasure." As the passenger settled into the back seat, Ethan carefully placed the briefcase beside him before gently closing the door. "Where are we headed today?" he asked. The gentleman quietly named one of the city's most prestigious five-star hotels, a destination known for hosting international executives, investors, and political leaders. Ethan acknowledged the address without surprise and smoothly pulled away from the curb. During the drive, the passenger occasionally admired the rain sliding across the windows while Ethan focused quietly on the road ahead. They exchanged only a few words, yet the silence between them felt comfortable rather than awkward. At one traffic light, Ethan noticed the elderly gentleman studying the city skyline with thoughtful eyes. "Beautiful morning," Ethan said softly. The passenger smiled. Sometimes rain allows people to notice things they usually ignore. Ethan nodded in quiet agreement. 20 minutes later, the towering entrance of the Grand Lexington Hotel appeared ahead, its polished stone facade reflecting the gray morning sky. Luxury vehicles lined the circular driveway, while valets hurried between arriving guests. Ethan carefully guided his aging taxi toward the entrance, unaware that within the next few minutes, one woman's careless judgment would transform an ordinary ride into a story no one standing beneath those marble arches would ever forget. Rain continued falling in a soft rhythm as Ethan Walker eased his taxi beneath the covered entrance of the Grand Lexington Hotel. Uniformed valets moved gracefully between luxury sedans, while bell attendants welcomed guests beneath sparkling crystal lights. The polished driveway reflected every passing vehicle like a mirror. Ethan shifted the transmission into park, stepped out without hesitation, and walked around to open the rear passenger door. Before he could reach it, another luxury sport utility vehicle swept into the circular entrance with unnecessary speed, stopping only a few feet away. The driver's door opened, and a woman dressed in an elegant cream-colored designer coat stepped confidently onto the wet pavement. Victoria Langford carried herself with the practiced certainty of someone accustomed to immediate attention. Diamond earrings caught the morning light, while expensive heels echoed sharply across the marble entrance. Behind her followed two professionally dressed associates carrying leather portfolios and tablet computers. A hotel employee immediately hurried toward her with an umbrella. Victoria barely acknowledged him as her eyes drifted toward Ethan's aging taxi. Her expression changed almost instantly. She slowed her pace, looked deliberately at the older vehicle, then at Ethan's modest clothing, before allowing a faint smile of disbelief to appear across her face. Several nearby guests noticed the exchange without understanding what had drawn her attention. Ethan remained focused on his responsibility. He reached for the rear passenger door with calm professionalism, intending to assist the elderly gentleman seated inside. Before he could open it, Victoria spoke loudly enough for everyone beneath the entrance canopy to hear. "Seriously?" she said with a dismissive laugh. "This hotel lets taxis like that block the main entrance now." Her associates exchanged uncomfortable glances but remained silent. A valet instinctively looked toward Ethan before quickly lowering his eyes. Ethan paused for only a brief moment, then continued opening the rear door exactly as though he had heard nothing. Victoria folded her arms and shook her head. "Some places really are lowering their standards," she continued. "Guests paying thousands of dollars per night should not have to arrive beside an old cab that belongs somewhere across town." Several people waiting near the revolving doors quietly turned toward Ethan. None of them spoke. The silence itself became heavy. Ethan gently offered his hand toward the elderly passenger still seated inside the taxi. "Please take your time, sir," he said softly. "The pavement is a little slippery." His voice remained steady, warm, and completely free of irritation. Victoria watched him with visible disbelief. "Did you even hear what I said?" she asked. Ethan looked toward her with calm blue eyes and offered nothing more than a polite smile. "I hope you have a pleasant morning, ma'am." His answer seemed to frustrate her even more. She appeared prepared for an argument, an apology, or some emotional reaction. Instead, she found only quiet dignity. One of her associates leaned closer and whispered something she could not quite hear. Victoria dismissed the comment with a slight wave of her hand before taking another glance at the worn taxi. "Some people simply do not know where they belong," she remarked loudly. The words drifted through the cool morning air and settled beneath the marble entrance. Ethan never answered. He simply stood beside the open rear door with one hand respectfully extended toward his passenger, patiently waiting. Around them, conversations gradually faded. Valets stopped moving for a brief moment. Hotel staff watched from inside the glass lobby. Nobody realized that the next person about to step out of that quiet taxi would change the atmosphere of the entire hotel within seconds. The elderly gentleman inside the taxi placed one hand lightly on the open door but made no attempt to step out immediately. Instead, he looked quietly toward Ethan Walker, whose calm expression had not changed despite every word spoken moments earlier. Ethan simply waited with patient courtesy, one hand steady on the door, allowing his passenger all the time he needed. The rain continued falling gently beyond the hotel canopy, creating a peaceful rhythm that somehow made the silence even more noticeable. Victoria Langford looked around as though expecting someone to support her remarks. A few guests avoided eye contact. Several hotel employees remained perfectly still, uncertain whether they should intervene. Ethan finally spoke, his voice measured and sincere. "Please be careful, sir. The marble can become slippery after the rain." The elderly passenger smiled appreciatively. "Thank you, Ethan." Hearing the taxi driver addressed by his first name surprised several people standing nearby. It suggested something far different from an ordinary commercial ride. Victoria noticed it as well, but dismissed the thought almost immediately. "I hope you are not planning to make everyone wait," she said impatiently while checking the time on her designer watch. Ethan neither defended himself nor answered the remark. Instead, he adjusted his stance slightly to shield the elderly gentleman from the light rain drifting beneath the entrance. One of the hotel valets quietly picked up an umbrella and began walking toward them, but before he arrived, the revolving doors suddenly opened from inside the hotel. The general manager hurried outside accompanied by the director of guest relations and two senior concierge staff members. Their expressions carried a mixture of anticipation and concern. The general manager scanned the driveway for only a moment before his eyes settled on the elderly gentleman still seated inside Ethan's taxi. His face immediately brightened. Without acknowledging the luxury vehicles waiting nearby, he walked directly toward the taxi with unmistakable respect. Victoria watched with growing confusion. "Good morning, sir," the general manager said warmly as he stopped beside the open door. "We are honored to welcome you back." The elderly passenger nodded politely, but remained seated for another brief moment. "Thank you. I appreciate your kindness." The director of guest relations quickly stepped forward, preparing to assist with the passenger's briefcase. Yet the elderly gentleman gently motioned toward Ethan instead. "He has already taken excellent care of everything," he said with a quiet smile. The hotel staff immediately turned toward Ethan with newfound appreciation. The general manager extended his hand. "Thank you for bringing our guests safely this morning." Ethan accepted the handshake modestly. "It was my pleasure." Victoria's confident posture began to soften ever so slightly. She recognized the extraordinary level of respect the hotel's leadership was showing this quiet passenger, but she still had no idea who he actually was. Before anyone could speak again, a black executive sedan entered the driveway behind the taxi. Two professionally dressed security specialists stepped out, followed by another senior executive carrying several folders. They approached the elderly gentleman with obvious familiarity, greeting him respectfully before waiting quietly for him to exit the vehicle. Hotel employees instinctively straightened their posture. Even the general manager took half a step backward, allowing the elderly passenger space. Ethan offered his arm with natural courtesy. The elderly gentleman accepted it, slowly rising from the back seat before stepping onto the polished marble beneath the entrance. The moment both of his feet touched the ground, every person standing beneath the canopy seemed to recognize that they were witnessing the arrival of someone whose influence extended far beyond the walls of the Grand Lexington Hotel. Victoria felt her heartbeat quicken as the elderly man turned toward Ethan with genuine gratitude, preparing to say something that would change the entire morning. The elderly gentleman adjusted his charcoal overcoat before turning toward Ethan Walker with a smile that reflected years of genuine friendship rather than simple gratitude. "Thank you, Ethan," he said warmly. "You have never once allowed me to carry my own briefcase, no matter how many times I have asked." Ethan smiled modestly. "Some habits are worth keeping, sir." The gentleman chuckled softly before accepting the leather briefcase from Ethan's hands. The general manager watched the exchange with obvious respect. "We have prepared everything for your arrival," he said politely. "Your meeting room is ready whenever you are." The elderly man nodded. "Excellent. But before we begin, there is someone I would like to recognize." He turned back toward Ethan instead of following the hotel staff inside. Victoria Langford remained frozen a few feet away, still unable to understand why the leadership team had welcomed an elderly passenger arriving in an ordinary taxi with such extraordinary courtesy. Her two associates quietly exchanged uncertain glances. The elderly gentleman looked toward the general manager. "Do you know how many years Ethan has been driving me?" The manager smiled apologetically. "I do not, sir." "Almost 12, the gentleman replied. "Hundreds of trips. Early mornings. Late evenings. Snowstorms. Heavy traffic. I have never once arrived late because of him." Ethan lowered his eyes slightly, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of attention. "You give me too much credit," he said quietly. The gentleman gently shook his head. "No, I simply tell the truth." He then looked toward everyone gathered beneath the hotel entrance. "Most people see a taxi driver. I see the man who has protected my schedule, respected my privacy, and treated every passenger with kindness regardless of who they were." Silence spread across the entrance. Even the light rain seemed quieter. Victoria slowly shifted her weight, suddenly aware that several nearby guests had begun looking in her direction after remembering the remarks she had made only moments earlier. The general manager smiled warmly at Ethan. "Your reputation clearly reaches farther than this hotel." Ethan answered with the same humility he had shown all morning. "I only try to do my job well." The elderly gentleman laughed softly. "That is exactly what makes you different." One of the executives who had arrived with the security team stepped closer. "Sir, the board members have already gathered upstairs." The gentleman nodded before replying. "They can wait another minute." The sentence immediately caught everyone's attention. Very few people postponed an executive board meeting. Almost no one delayed it for a taxi driver. The elderly passenger turned fully toward Ethan and extended his hand. Instead of a quick handshake, he clasped Ethan's hand firmly with both of his own. "Thank you for another safe journey," he said sincerely. "I trust you more than anyone else behind a steering wheel." Ethan smiled with quiet gratitude. "That means more to me than you know." Victoria's confident expression had completely disappeared. For the first time that morning, she seemed genuinely uncertain. The elderly gentleman finally turned toward her. His voice remained calm, respectful, and completely free of anger. "Ma'am," he said gently, You spoke about standards a few minutes ago. I agree that standards matter very much. That is exactly why I continue choosing Ethan after all these years. His standards cannot be measured by the age of his taxi. No one spoke. The words settled naturally across the entrance without accusation or humiliation. Ethan remained perfectly still, almost wishing the attention would pass. Yet every employee, guest, and executive standing beneath the marble canopy now understood something Victoria had completely overlooked. The quiet taxi driver possessed a reputation that could never be purchased, and the elderly passenger preparing to enter the Grand Lexington Hotel valued that reputation far more than appearances ever could. The elderly gentleman glanced toward the executives waiting patiently beside the hotel entrance before returning his attention to Ethan Walker. A quiet smile crossed his face, carrying the weight of memories that only the two of them fully understood. Most people believe loyalty begins with contracts, he said gently. I learned long ago that loyalty begins with character. Ethan lowered his eyes modestly. You have always been kind to me, sir. The gentleman slowly shook his head. No, Ethan. You were kind to me long before anyone else believed I deserved it. Curiosity spread through the gathering crowd. Even Victoria Langford seemed unable to look away now. The general manager spoke carefully. If you do not mind me asking, how did the two of you first meet? The elderly passenger smiled at the question. Almost 12 years ago, before many people in this city knew my name, I had just finished a difficult meeting that ended with the collapse of a business partnership. I walked outside carrying nothing except this same leather briefcase and far more uncertainty than confidence. It was raining much like today. He paused briefly while the soft rain continued falling beyond the covered entrance. Every taxi I tried to stop ignored me because I was standing several blocks away from the business district during rush hour. Then Ethan arrived. Ethan remembered the morning immediately, but remained silent. He never asked where I worked. He never asked whether I could afford the ride. He simply welcomed me into his cab as though I mattered. The gentleman smiled warmly toward Ethan. During that drive, I realized I had forgotten my wallet inside the office building I had just left. I apologized and told Ethan I would understand if he needed to return me immediately. Several listeners leaned closer. Instead, the gentleman continued. Ethan smiled exactly the way he still smiles today. He told me that everyone deserves to arrive home safely, even on their worst day. He drove me all the way across the city without asking for a single dollar. Ethan quietly answered, I believed you would do the same for someone else one day. The gentleman laughed softly. You had more faith in me than I had in myself. Victoria slowly lowered her eyes. The confidence she had displayed only minutes earlier had disappeared completely. The elderly passenger continued. A week later, I returned to repay him. He accepted only the original fare and refused every additional dollar I offered. When I asked why, he simply said that kindness should never become a business transaction. One of the executives standing nearby smiled with quiet admiration. The general manager folded his hands respectfully. That explains a great deal. The gentleman nodded. Over the years, my circumstances changed. My company grew beyond anything I once imagined. People suddenly wanted meetings, partnerships, photographs, and introductions. Many treated me differently because of success. Ethan never changed. Every trip began with the same simple greeting. Every ride ended with the same wish that I would have a peaceful day. Ethan looked slightly embarrassed by the attention. I only tried to treat every passenger the same. Exactly, the gentleman replied. That is why I never stopped calling him. A gentle silence settled over the entrance once again. The expensive suits, polished marble, luxury automobiles, and executive titles suddenly seemed less impressive than the quiet man standing beside an aging taxi. Victoria understood that the greatest influence in front of her had not been created by wealth or status. It had been earned years earlier through one ordinary act of compassion that no audience had witnessed, yet its value had continued growing with every passing year. For several long seconds, nobody beneath the hotel entrance spoke. The only sound came from the gentle rain tapping against the stone driveway beyond the protective canopy. Victoria Langford slowly stepped forward, her confident posture replaced by visible uncertainty. The sharp certainty that had filled her voice only minutes earlier had disappeared completely. She looked first at the elderly gentleman, then at Ethan Walker, before quietly lowering her eyes. Mr. Walker, she said carefully, I owe you an apology. Ethan immediately shook his head with a gentle smile. You do not owe me anything, ma'am. Victoria took a slow breath. I do. Her voice had become noticeably softer. I made assumptions about you before I knew a single thing about who you were. Ethan remained calm. Sometimes we all see only what is directly in front of us. She looked at the aging taxi parked beside the entrance. I saw an old car. Ethan nodded. It is an old car. A few people nearby smiled quietly. There was no sarcasm in his answer, only simple honesty. Victoria continued. I believed your vehicle represented your worth. I was wrong. Ethan glanced briefly toward the rain before returning his attention to her. A vehicle only tells people how someone travels. It does not tell them how someone lives. The sentence settled gently over everyone standing nearby. Even the hotel employees seemed to pause for a moment, reflecting on the quiet wisdom hidden inside such ordinary words. The elderly gentleman smiled warmly. That is another reason I continue riding with Ethan. Every conversation leaves me thinking long after the trip ends. Victoria nodded slowly. I understand that now. She extended her hand toward Ethan with genuine sincerity. I am truly sorry for the way I spoke to you. Ethan accepted the handshake without hesitation. His expression showed neither victory nor resentment. Thank you, he replied kindly. I hope today turns out to be a good day for you. She seemed surprised by how easily he accepted her apology. You are not angry. Ethan smiled softly. Carrying anger makes every road feel longer. The elderly gentleman quietly laughed. I have heard many successful people give speeches about leadership. Few have explained it better than that. One of Victoria's associates finally spoke for the first time. That is something worth remembering. The general manager looked toward his staff. I believe all of us have learned something valuable this morning. Several employees nodded almost instinctively. One young valet glanced toward Ethan's aging taxi with an expression completely different from the one he had worn when the vehicle first arrived. The car had not changed. Only the people looking at it had. The elderly gentleman checked his watch before turning toward Ethan once more. I suppose I should finally allow these executives to begin their meeting. Ethan smiled. They have been very patient. Not nearly as patient as you, the gentleman answered. Before following the hotel leadership inside, he reached into his coat pocket and removed a small business card. He handed it quietly to the general manager. Please make one request for me. Of course, sir. Whenever Mr. Walker visits this hotel, whether he arrives as a driver or as a guest, I hope he will always be welcomed with the same respect shown to every person who walks through these doors. The general manager accepted the card with both hands. You have my word. Ethan looked almost uncomfortable receiving such attention, yet he simply thanked everyone with the same modest smile he had worn throughout the morning. As the elderly gentleman disappeared through the revolving doors beside the hotel executives, Victoria remained standing beside Ethan's old taxi, realizing that the greatest lesson she had received that year had not come from a boardroom, a conference, or a business seminar. It had come from a quiet driver who never once needed to raise his voice in order to change someone's heart. The morning gradually returned to its normal rhythm after the executives disappeared inside the hotel, yet something invisible had changed beneath the marble entrance. Conversations resumed more quietly than before, and hotel employees greeted arriving guests with a little more attention than they had only an hour earlier. Ethan Walker gently closed the rear passenger door of his taxi, wiped a few raindrops from the chrome handle with a clean cloth, and prepared to leave exactly as he had done thousands of times before. He expected nothing more than another ordinary fare somewhere across the city. Before he could step into the driver's seat, the general manager called his name. Mr. Walker, would you mind waiting just one moment? Ethan turned politely. Of course. The general manager walked toward him carrying a small umbrella despite the rain already beginning to fade. Our guest asked me to give you something before you left. Ethan accepted a neatly folded envelope. Thank you. He also asked me to tell you that next Tuesday will be the same pickup time as always. Ethan smiled warmly. I already have it written in my schedule. The manager laughed softly. I suspected you would. Victoria Langford remained nearby, speaking quietly with her associates. For the first time that morning, nobody seemed interested in discussing meetings or contracts. Instead, all three watched Ethan with genuine curiosity. One of the associates finally approached him. May I ask you something? Ethan nodded. Certainly. How do you stay so calm when people treat you unfairly? Ethan considered the question for a brief moment before answering. Because another person's opinion does not have to become my identity. The simple sentence lingered in the air. The associate slowly nodded. I will remember that. Ethan smiled kindly before opening the taxi door. Just then, an elderly couple carrying 2 small suitcases emerged from the hotel lobby, looking uncertain as they searched for transportation. Ethan immediately stepped away from his own vehicle and hurried over to assist them. He lifted one suitcase into the trunk with gentle care before opening the rear door for the couple exactly as he had done for every passenger that morning. Neither of them recognized him from the earlier conversation. To them, he was simply a courteous taxi driver willing to help. Victoria quietly watched every movement. There was no audience now, no executives, no hotel leadership, and no reason for Ethan to continue proving anything. Yet his kindness remained exactly the same. He greeted the elderly couple with the same respectful smile, wished them a pleasant day, and carefully adjusted the rear seat to make their ride more comfortable. Nothing about his behavior changed when nobody important was watching. The realization affected Victoria more deeply than anything the elderly gentleman had said. Character, she finally understood, was not something displayed during extraordinary moments. It was revealed during ordinary ones. As Ethan prepared to leave, the general manager noticed another hotel employee hurrying toward the entrance with a delivery cart. The young employee paused beside Ethan. "Mr. Walker," he said shyly, "thank you." Ethan looked surprised. "For what?" The young man smiled. "I started working here only 3 weeks ago. Watching everything that happened this morning reminded me why respect matters." Ethan gently placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Then today has already been worthwhile." With that, he quietly climbed into his aging taxi, started the engine, and slowly pulled away from the Grand Lexington Hotel. Few people noticed the old sedan disappearing into the city traffic, but those who did no longer saw an aging cab. They saw a quiet man whose greatest reputation had never depended on wealth, titles, or recognition. It had been built one respectful ride at a time, over countless ordinary days that no newspaper would ever report. Yet everyone fortunate enough to meet him somehow carried a little more kindness long after he had driven away. Several months quietly passed, and summer gradually replaced the cool spring mornings that had framed the unforgettable encounter at the Grand Lexington Hotel. Chicago moved with its usual energy, yet certain people carried that rainy morning with them far longer than they expected. Ethan Walker continued driving the same carefully maintained taxi through familiar streets. His routine never changed. Every morning he polished the dashboard, stocked fresh bottled water, arranged mint candies in the back seat, and greeted each passenger with the same sincere smile. Executives, students, tourists, nurses, construction workers, grandparents, and young families all received identical courtesy. If anyone recognized him from that remarkable day, Ethan never mentioned it. To him, every new ride deserved a fresh beginning. Inside the Grand Lexington Hotel, subtle changes slowly became part of the daily culture. The general manager introduced a new orientation session for every employee joining the hotel. Instead of beginning with policies or guest rankings, he spoke first about respect. Without mentioning names, he reminded new staff members that appearances rarely revealed the full value of a person. The story quietly spread from one employee to another until it became part of the hotel's identity. Guests noticed warmer greetings. Valets became more attentive to every arriving vehicle regardless of its age. Bell attendants treated every visitor with equal professionalism. No announcement had ever been made. Yet one ordinary morning had gently reshaped the attitude of an entire workplace. Victoria Langford experienced perhaps the greatest transformation of all. She found herself replaying Ethan's simple words during business meetings, charity events, and conversations with colleagues. More than once, she caught herself forming quick judgments about someone before remembering the quiet taxi driver who had changed her perspective forever. Gradually, she began asking questions before making conclusions. She listened more carefully. She thanked employees more often. Her associates noticed the difference long before she ever spoke about it. One afternoon, while leaving another meeting at the Grand Lexington Hotel, Victoria spotted Ethan's familiar taxi waiting near the entrance. Instead of walking past, she approached with a genuine smile. Ethan immediately stepped out, and opened the rear door with his usual courtesy. "Good afternoon, ma'am." Victoria smiled warmly. "Good afternoon, Ethan. Would you mind driving me to my office?" "I would be happy to." During the ride, neither of them mentioned the uncomfortable events from months earlier. They spoke instead about the beautiful weather, Chicago traffic, neighborhood parks, and the best places to find fresh coffee downtown. The conversation felt surprisingly natural. As the taxi stopped outside her office building, Victoria handed Ethan the exact fare before pausing for a moment. "May I tell you something?" Ethan nodded politely. "Of course." She smiled with quiet gratitude. "You probably do not realize it, but you changed the way I lead people." Ethan looked genuinely surprised. "I only drove you across town." Victoria gently shook her head. "No, you showed me that dignity never asks for attention. It simply remains consistent." Ethan smiled with the same calm kindness that had first unsettled her months earlier. "I am glad our conversation was useful." Before stepping onto the sidewalk, Victoria looked back once more. "Thank you, Ethan. Have a wonderful afternoon," he replied. She watched the aging taxi disappear into afternoon traffic, realizing she no longer saw an old vehicle. She saw a quiet reminder that the strongest influence in life often arrives without expensive clothing, impressive titles, or public applause. Sometimes it simply arrives behind the steering wheel of a well-worn taxi, carrying a person whose greatest achievement is treating every stranger with exactly the same respect. Another year quietly passed, and the city continued moving with its endless rhythm of traffic lights, crowded sidewalks, and countless strangers crossing paths without ever knowing how deeply one ordinary moment could shape another life. Ethan Walker still began each morning exactly the same way. Before sunrise, he carefully washed his aging taxi, checked every tire, wiped every window until it reflected the first light of day, placed fresh bottled water inside the back seat, arranged mint candies in their familiar place, and whispered the same quiet promise to himself that he had carried for decades. Treat every passenger as though they matter, because they do. Nothing about his routine suggested extraordinary success, yet everything about it reflected extraordinary character. On a bright autumn morning, the elderly gentleman once again scheduled his familiar ride to the Grand Lexington Hotel. Ethan arrived precisely on time, greeted him with the same warm smile, and carefully opened the rear door just as he always had. Neither man mentioned the events of the previous year. They spoke instead about changing leaves, grandchildren, favorite books, and the peaceful beauty of ordinary mornings. Some friendships no longer needed dramatic conversations because mutual respect had already said everything important. When they reached the hotel, the entrance looked different from the one Ethan remembered. Luxury vehicles still lined the driveway, elegant guests still entered beneath polished stone arches, and hotel employees still moved with professional precision. Yet something subtle had changed. Every arriving vehicle, whether an expensive limousine or an aging family sedan, received exactly the same courteous welcome. Valets greeted every driver with equal respect. Bell attendants smiled at every guest before noticing clothing, luggage, or status. The culture itself had quietly transformed. The general manager noticed Ethan's taxi immediately and walked outside with a welcoming smile. "Good morning, Mr. Walker. It is wonderful to see you again." Ethan smiled modestly. "Good morning. It is nice to be back." As the elderly gentleman stepped onto the pavement, he looked around the entrance before quietly saying, "It feels different here." The general manager nodded. "It is different." He paused before continuing. "One ordinary morning reminded all of us that first impressions should never become final judgments." The elderly gentleman smiled knowingly. Ethan simply listened in silence. Nearby, Victoria Langford happened to arrive for another meeting. This time, before anyone else could greet her, she walked directly toward Ethan and offered a warm handshake. "It is good to see you again," she said sincerely. Ethan accepted the greeting with the same quiet kindness he extended to every passenger. "I hope you have been well." "Very well," she answered, "and much wiser." They both smiled. No further explanation was necessary. The elderly gentleman looked from one person to another before quietly saying, "Sometimes the greatest victories leave behind no losers, only better people." No one disagreed. As the morning continued, Ethan returned to his taxi, adjusted the rearview mirror, and slowly drove back into the flow of city traffic. Within minutes, he had become just another yellow cab moving through busy streets, nearly invisible among thousands of others. Yet countless people who had crossed his path now viewed the world a little differently because of him. Some stories are remembered because powerful people change history. Others remain unforgettable because quiet people change hearts without ever asking for recognition. Ethan never became famous. He never appeared on television or stood behind a podium. He simply continued driving from one destination to the next, proving every single day that genuine dignity does not arrive with wealth, titles, or applause. It travels quietly beside humility, speaks softly through consistent kindness, and leaves every road a little brighter than it found it.